Okay, good evening. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to SDS Thursday, presented to you by SDS Seminars. We are a UK-based company and have been operating in the field of psychological skills training for over 30 years. I think it's 33 years. So we are very experienced, but changing all the time. And 3 years ago, when the first lockdown started, we started this SDS Thursdays. First, just to see faces, to see people, to say, you are not alone, we are not alone, we're still here for each other. But then it continued, and even though we're out of lockdown now, we decided to continue with SDS Thursdays, just to share some information with you. And actually, next year, we will be changing the format quite considerably, and we'll make it more about problems than causes, but later about it at a later stage. So my name is Dr. Julia Budnik. I'm one of the directors of SDS Seminars, but now I want to introduce my co-director, Paul Grantham, and ask the first question, Paul. How did this course come about? Why you and Andrew decided to get together and to create this course? So, Paul, please.
Well, I guess it's one of those things that sort of came out of initially a sort of a vague awareness on my part, which I then sort of took as a prompt for a conversation with Andrew, really, which is that I've certainly noticed a change, particularly, I think, it's difficult to give it a time scale, but I would certainly say over the last few years, and possibly particularly, I think, since the pandemic started, for an increasing number of folks that I have contact with to be working in private practice, either full-time or part-time. And that's in a range of settings. It's partly from my training experience, it's partly from my clinical experience, and just meeting people and having conversations really at conferences and workshops. So that had been vaguely on my mind. And that's been quite a change, can I hasten to add. I think that there has been, or that was my perception at least, was that there had been quite a bit of expansion in the number of people either going into private practice or alternatively thinking about doing so. And also, I guess the other thing that had struck me, which I've been aware of as well for a few years, was the point at which people enter into private practice. So historically, it might be the case that individuals might go into an employed position for a number of years, and then after a certain period of time, when they had a certain level of experience, they would then go into maybe part-time or full-time private practice. That seemed to me to change, and certainly when I was chatting to Andrew about this, his experience, particularly on the counselling side, was that this was very similar, and that one of the key reasons for this, probably not that surprisingly, was that actually, although at one level there appears to be a big expansion in the number of posts that are actually around within employed organisations, actually the number of people who are coming off of training courses actually far exceeds that. And generally speaking, I think my general impression was that there was a big expansion in the number of people that were thinking of doing this or going into it. The other thing that I was quite aware of, which sort of was also in the back of my mind, was that I'd sort of come across some recent data which had indicated that up to around about 50% of people who go into private practice in the counselling and therapy field are not able to maintain that after a 2-year period. In other words, this is not in any way, shape or form an automatic success for people. And I think that people either sort of wander in and think, well, all I've got to do is to hang my sign up and I'll have clients coming through the door, or alternatively, I think they sort of just hope that things will actually happen. And the reality is that doesn't occur. And I think that one of the things that really struck me was that there's really, really very little support or guidance really for people, both in terms of how you actually do this. And I would argue most importantly, two things really. One, how you make a success of it, because at the end of the day, this is about, you know, paying a mortgage or paying rent or whatever, having earning a living from it. But there's another thing as well, which I became I was vaguely aware of, but which I think Andrew made much clearer to me, was the fact that for people who come out of an employed situation where they've been used to working with an employer, typically their employer takes care of a whole load of things for them to the degree that they never have to think about them. I mean, I won't go into the detail of what those are, because I think Andrew will probably be saying something about that in a minute. But actually, when you go out into private practice, you're basically on your own, and you are typically responsible for all these particular things. And there are some major pitfalls around, particularly, I think, on ethical and legal issues. And so again, we thought that maybe this was going to be quite important to tackle. So that sort of led Andrew and I to have a conversation about this. And then what I did was I then sent, I don't know how many of you received this or remembered this, I then sent out an email, which was basically asking people whether they were interested in this particular topic area, and what sorts of things they were actually interested in learning. And we had an overwhelming response. Over 250 people replied to this, with a whole interesting range of different concerns. So it was partly that which has ended up, to be honest with you, influencing the content of this particular course. It does genuinely come, at least in part, from the issues that you and other people who are the folks that we work with have actually raised, really. So that's how we've decided to put the training together. One other final thing I'll say before I sort of hand things over really to Andrew, about the format that we're using for this, which is a sequence of monthly 2-hour sessions. Each of these, by the way, will have a sort of key action point reminder points on each one. And there's a month in between each particular session, which also gives you an increased ability, really, to start putting things into practice, to have some sort of ideas about how they're working, how they're not working. And then, of course, you come back to the next session and we can help to follow through on those particular things, along with, of course, the follow-up sessions that we're running for folks to come along to, which if you've signed up for the whole course, you get access to free of charge. So we've designed something which we think is very, very practical, which goes and attempts to address the needs of people who are either thinking of going into private practice, maybe some folks who are thinking of retiring and moving into private practice, some folks who are coming straight off a training course, and also folks who are already in private practice, but to be honest with you, have never really had an opportunity to either think through what's actually required, and are, to be blunt with you, trying to wing it, or alternatively, folks who are thinking to themselves, how can I increase my customer base, really? How can I get more clients to actually work with? So we're attempting to try and meet those needs through this series of particular events that we're running. Yeah, I'll stop at that particular point, or else, as you know what I'm like, I ramble on.
I do know.
And I will pass things over to Andrew.
Yes, thank you, Paul. And before we introduce Andrew, I wanted to ask you, as you listen to Andrew's presentation, can you please keep in your mind and think what areas which Andrew will be talking about are of particular interest to you? Because I've read through the chat and lots of people are already running a small private practice or large one. Lots of people are thinking about it. So listen to Andrew's presentation and write in the chat box what areas you find particularly useful and would be interested in. Okay, so that's your little task for this presentation. So Andrew, very welcome, and please say hello so we can see you.
Thanks, Julia. Thank you, Paul, and welcome. Nice to see everybody. Good evening, depending where you are in the world. It could be good evening or good morning or good afternoon or good night. Whatever suits you best, go with it. But it's a delight to see you, and I'm really excited about doing this. And from my own experience as well, working as a coach as well in private practice, I get a lot of people who are starting their private practice and are kind of wanting help in getting it going. And I'm not touting for business because I don't have any spaces, but I just wanted to kind of reflect that that this is a big issue for many people. And who am I? Well, I'm a registered social worker. I'm a BACP senior accredited counsellor psychotherapist. I don't know how long the senior accredited bit will last. We'll see what happens with Scoped. But at the moment, this week, I'm senior accredited counsellor psychotherapist, and I'm an accredited coach too. And I've been working in private practice for about 25 plus years in various forms. I would say probably for 2/3 of that time, a private practice that ran concurrently with working in an employed situation. So working for an employer, which were kind of different contexts, mental health crisis services, or working with schools and with colleges and universities. But probably about the last 7-8 years, I've worked as a therapist exclusively now in private practice, and it is a wonderful thing and an incredibly stressful thing too. Wonderful because it means that you are liberated from all those awful things that organizations ask you to do that you don't agree with, or have to work in a 6-session model. I've worked in 8-session models, and then resources got tight. It was 6-session models, and then resources got tighter, and it was 4-session model. As I left, it was single-session therapy. And I kind of wondered if we were going to get to a point where we just walked past each other at the bus stop and called it therapy. So you're liberated from all of that because you can design and work your private practice as it works for you. And I see from the chat, quite a few of you are already in private practice. So it'll be really interesting to hear how you do that. Challenging, of course, because as Paul said, all those things that we are frustrated by with organizations are also those things quite often which provide us the safety nets and security, things around policies and procedures and practices and data management and referrals, and sometimes the management of money, and ensuring that we are compliant with appropriate legislation and working within kind of good ethics, regardless of whichever professional body we're in. They all have ethical codes and frameworks that we're consistent with them. And that people come to those organizations and they manage all of that process. And if we find that we are unwell and go off sick, we may get sick pay, whereas having just been unwell a few weeks ago and having unusually to cancel all my clients, of course, the money then stops. And so there are real stresses, there are advantages and disadvantages, but there are things that we can do to help safeguard what we do and to kind of really enjoy the process. And I will say, I thoroughly enjoy my work as a private practitioner, and wouldn't not do it now. So what I'm going to do, it's 7:20. I'm going to whiz through some of the slides have already been covered, I think, by Juliet and Paul, so I won't labor those. I'll just flag them. And what I want to do is talk a little bit about the 6 sessions and what we intend to cover. And then what I'm going to do is focus on one little aspect of one of the sessions, which I'll explain when we get to it, and just talk about some of the things that we might talk about that. And that will be around working with risk in private practice. So just a little bit of information about some of the things that we need to think about in working with risk. And then I will shut up. We will open back to the group, and I'll ask you a couple of questions, and hopefully for those of you who are okay talking on Zoom, we'll have a conversation, or if not, by all means put comments, questions in the chat. There's no expectation that you have to contribute. And the final thing to say before I share my screen is that I'm not offering a modality specific training here. So this is a training course for people working in private practice. The modality that you bring to private practice is your modality, is your way of working. I noticed some of you are psychodynamic, some of you are working in kind of more psychology orientated professions, some of you have a coaching practice, some are person-centered. And so what I hope is that the content over the sessions that we cover will be good plugins to what you do. I'm not here to convert you to a particular way of working. Just for reference, my very original training was psychodynamic. I then did a full qualification in person-centered. I've done CBT work. I would now define myself as a pluralistic practitioner, which means it's an integrative practice that works explicitly and collaboratively with my clients from a person-centered frame. But I'm not here to sell that to you. So let's see if I can share the screen, whiz through these, I have to say, rather beautiful slides, and then come back to you shortly. Now, Julia and Paul, thumbs up. Can you see those? All right. Excellent. So how to set up a private practice and make it a success. That's what we're going to talk about today. So what we're going to cover over the next probably 20 minutes, 25 minutes, is just to kind of reinforce who this might be for, which I think probably Paul and Julia have helpfully talked about already. So I won't labour that point. I want to spend more of the time talking about the individual sessions and the sort of content that we will cover. Although I also want the sessions to be kind of co-constructed, co-created, if you like, with those who are attending. So I will have the content prepared. I will have all the key stuff that you're wanting, but I'm a sort of trainer that likes to do it in collaboration, so we can focus on areas and bring in other areas that perhaps aren't already there if they're not covered elsewhere. So this is certainly something that you could make more bespoke for you. Highlight why this might be a useful thing for you to do, and then I'm going to focus just on a little bit of content from one of the sessions, just to give you a little bit of a taster of some of the discussions we might have, and then move on to our discussions. As I said, this I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. Paul and Julia have covered this. Suffice to say, 6 modules, 2 hours per session, and the free follow-up sessions after the course ends, because I think one of the things the three of us were really keen to do is to try and start establishing a community of practice as well, which we'll talk about in just a short moment. And again, to kind of reinforce what's been said, who is this course for? Of course, it's for people who are perhaps soon to be leaving training, or have left training and have been working in an organizational setting, maybe counsellors, psychotherapists, or therapeutic coaches, and are thinking about setting up a private practice for a first time. As I've seen in the chat, quite a few of you already have some sort of private practice going, and maybe this course is an opportunity in those early days to do a bit of an audit of your work, a kind of a check-in with the course and with others on the course about kind of some of the difficulties you've encountered and some of the successes you've encountered. Likewise, those who've perhaps been in private practice for some time, perhaps for many years, and feel that it's going well. But one of the questions I'm often asked by private practitioners is, how can I develop this? What are the next steps? Because private practice doesn't just have to be our one-to-one work with our clients or with couples. Of course, private practice can be broader, and in my private practice, I do things like this. I do things like training, and I write and I publish. So private practice will, the content will be focused particularly on our work with clients, but I'd like us to bring in some opportunity to think about private practice also in that broader context, because that can help mitigate some of the risks if perhaps we're struggling to find clients aren't coming through the door. What else can we do to make our practice financially viable? And as I say, to create a supportive space, not only in the follow-up meetings, but also in the sessions. I'm really keen that these are supportive for you. So session 1, module 1, will be about first steps. And it's not just about finding a room or getting the right online platform or thinking about who you want to work with, but we'll spend some time thinking about, why are we motivated to do this? You know, is it because we're struggling to find paid employment, or we've found paid employment and we don't like it, or we simply want to take a next developmental step? We will want perhaps more control over what we do. And I think our motivations, whether we are thinking of starting or already starting, are really, really critical, because they will begin to shape, if you like, the philosophical positioning of what we do and why we do it, as well as the kind of skills, knowledges and abilities that we already possess. If we're moving into private practice, I assume that we are qualified, of course, in our activity. So we're qualified as psychotherapists or as psychologists or as counsellors or as coaches. So I'm making an assumption that those people on the course are either already qualified or soon to be qualified, so they can begin to think about their work. But we're not blank slates, and almost all of us come from different contexts and different settings professionally. So what are the skills that we already have that actually are very transferable into making this work? Because I think often we think of ourselves as, I'm a counsellor, so therefore I need to draw my counselling skills to make this work. But actually there's a whole range of personal and professional experiences and skill sets that we can draw on. So we'll think a little bit about a time of doing a bit of an audit. You know, where are we already? What do we already have that perhaps we're using well or we could use better? What are the key developmental areas? You know, what are the things that we want to do, and what's the scope? You know, these are big questions. What type of client group do we want to work with? Are we best positioned to work with that client group? If we're working with children and young people, how will we think about the safeguarding implications for that? How will we think about the space, the physical or the virtual space in which we work? Or are we particularly interested in kind of presentations? Some people are interested in working with trauma or with depression and anxiety, or with body dysmorphia, or with trans issues, or with gender issues, or with issues around kind of eating and eating related issues. Whatever they are, you know, do we have a particular interest or specialism? And if we do, how might we begin to successfully communicate that? And the aim is, by the end of session 1, you'll be able to describe your own existing strengths and areas for development around skills, knowledges and abilities, but also create a personal development plan and a professional development plan about, you know, where are you now and where are your kind of growing edges? What are the things that you feel you need to do to take the next steps? And I'd like us to think about creating a bit of a strategy for ourselves. You know, what's a strategy for the first or second year of our practice, and what are the milestones for that be? You know, what is it we want to achieve by starting our practice, and how will we know whether we're hitting those points, our own benchmarks? I'm not setting benchmarks for you, so your own benchmarks, and what do we do to build on that? And as Paul said, that will be supported through the kind of key checklist that will be available at the end of each of the modules. Session 2 then starts to look a little bit more about the kind of the nuts and bolts, the things that we really need to get right. You know, what are the fundamental building blocks to ensure that what we're doing is equitable, fair, and responsive to inclusivity and diversity, and also grounded in ethical thinking. So what are ethics in action? How do we translate something like a code of ethics or an ethical framework into our day-to-day thinking so it becomes embedded and we can feel more confident? There are, of course, key parameters, and in part that will be defined by the kind of locality and jurisdiction in which you're practicing, but also there will be kind of broader principles that I think are appropriate across the board in terms of the Information Commissioner's Office registration. Or how are we managing data? Are we registered for that? Are we meeting our legal requirements? Do we understand our legal requirements? Do we have kind of benchmarks of policies or practice? How do we manage issues like risk and safeguarding and so on? If we're concerned about a client, it can feel quite lonely as an independent practitioner if we're immediately concerned about somebody's well-being. So what is good contracting in private practice? How should private practitioners get the contracting right? And my experience from a context I worked in before when I was chair of BACP is that one of the most repeated areas in professional conduct concerns often centers around the private practitioner, and often centers around poor communication and kind of not poor contracting, but contracting that isn't thought through. And the contract is the bedrock for what we do. So what can we develop in terms of best practice, and how can we learn from others in the group to help ensure that we really get the foundations of what we're doing absolutely correct? So by the end of it, and with a little bit of help from the group, from me, and from the checklist that you'll have, you'll be able to hopefully describe in a bit more detail how you're integrating ethics. Not that you understand ethics, but how you're integrating that into your routine thinking. That you've done a kind of checklist for yourself around kind of key policies or position statements that you need to make. And that you're clear about what you're going to do in response to issues such as safeguarding risk, contracting, referral process, to support you, but also to support your client, and that you're aware of and are compliant with some of the key kind of non-negotiable aspects of what we do around data protection, about paying our tax. We've perhaps got a slightly more efficient system of just sticking receipts in a drawer and hoping that they don't get fallen down the back and suddenly we're not declaring things that we should declare. There are some really good systems out there to make the whole issue of tax and tax management so much better. And thoughts around record keeping. How do you want to keep records? How do you want to store records? And how are you going to manage records in relation to your client? But none of that happens if you are the world's best kept secret. If nobody knows that you're in practice and nobody knows that you're offering a service. So one of the key things we need to do is getting the word out, telling the world, telling our potential clients, telling our potential referrers that we exist and what we do. So we're going to cover kind of how we take the aims and scope of our work, such as focus or specialisms that we've covered in session 1, and begin to communicate them in an efficient and effective way. We know from research, for example, that a really good quality and appropriate photograph is the first thing that clients will look for when they see therapy. I once saw a photograph, and I jest not, of somebody offering trauma-based therapy, and their photograph on their website, and I will have to demonstrate it to you, was now. That might be a very nice image, but probably doesn't communicate the safety and containment that a potential client might want. What's our voice as an independent practitioner? And what I mean by that is, what's the tone of our communication? Because we can get that wrong really, really easily. So when a client sees us on perhaps social media or goes to a website, what are we communicating, but how are we communicating? It's not just the words we use, it's the tone, it's the written intonation, or in any podcast that we do or any videos that we do for potential clients or users of our service. How do we get that right? Because as we know, the most important thing about kind of therapy and coaching is the relationship. Research has told us that for many, many years, that we can have all the techniques that we want, but actually it's the quality of the relationship. And the relationship begins before your client logs on or walks through the door of your room. The relationship begins the moment they make virtual contact with you. So it's absolutely critical. And I've seen quite a few people in private practice who are saying, I don't understand it. I'm just not getting any interest in my work. And then we together look at the website and, well, it's awful. And so we can begin to think about how people can position themselves and what are the value added things that we can do to increase our profile. So by the end of this, hopefully you'll have a good sense of being able to describe what you intend to do or what you are doing or what you're going to develop or review. to think about your aims and what your voice is, that it's not that I want people to go away and have a unified voice, that everybody kind of speaks a therapy language online, but you speak authentically in your language, in your voice, about your practice, about what you're passionate about, so that people read stuff and they already start to feel as if they're making a connection with you. We could look at a range of platforms. My guess is that people are very familiar with platforms already, but there are some great, easy platforms for building our own website. We don't need a lot of technical knowledge for doing that. We don't need to spend thousands of pounds on web developers. If we have no confidence at all, of course, we can think about how we do that. But there's some really great, very straightforward platforms for building websites. And how do we use social media? And what should our social media presence look like? What are the client-facing materials going to look like? And just to say, there are quite a few therapists at the moment on social media who are getting it very badly wrong, who are inadvertently communicating something about themselves and about the profession that probably isn't very helpful. It's becoming a bigger professional conduct issue. So I'm wanting us to get it right. I'm wanting us to really use our social media presence to enhance the confidence in us, enhance the confidence in therapy, and also to look at ways in which we can think beyond traditional web and social media mechanisms, other ways of disseminating thoughts, ideas, and practice. Maybe writing, maybe training, maybe attending webinars, maybe doing podcasts, all sorts of things that we can do that kind of further enhance the groundedness of our private practice. Session 4 is about kind of the if you like, the internal supervisory parameters of what we do, the normative, formative, restorative, and reflexive elements of our work. So is my private practice delivering therapy safely, ethically, and professionally? And how do I know? What additional skills do I need or want to develop to further develop what I want to do? As I say, lots of people start in private practice in individual work and then want to kind of push the parameters, perhaps develop a particular expertise or do more training or do more writing. What are the areas that I want to focus on? And money is tight, you know, we can't just throw vast sums of money at all sorts of training in a scattergun way and hoping that something will fit. So developing a bit of a strategy. The restorative, how do I look after myself? What is self-care like? And private practice can be very lonely. You know, we can have a very successful private practice with lots of people coming through the door, but actually we're just sitting in front of a computer all day, or we're just sitting in a room all day, and we don't have that collegial network around us. And a reflexive position. How do I draw on my own insight, my own reflexivity to best support my work? So being able to think and understand and describe more about the normative, formative, restorative considerations, and to develop a strategy for reflexivity and also continuing professional development. This is always the tricky one, because this is the one that people normally switch off from. But that whole notion of evaluation, and I don't just mean in the rigid sense of a questionnaire that we give to our clients, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, how fabulous was I today type of questionnaire. I'm talking about that, but also broader evaluation. So I want us to spend time thinking about, why should I invest my time and energy in evaluating when actually I'm a therapist and my focus is therapy? And that's the most common thing I hear. I'm a therapist, my focus is on the relationship. Why should I be doing that? So what are the opportunities, but also the challenges of evaluating my practice? It might be quite scary, but it also might inform my professional development. And what are the things that I can do that are therapeutically supportive, so I can evaluate, but also become part of the therapy? So in a sense, they become embedded in the client's change process, but also our change process. And the evidence suggests that the most effective therapists, whether working in independent practice or in employed work, are those that regularly check in about the efficacy of what they're doing, that they're inquisitive about what they do. There's all sorts of online systems out there to help evaluate what we do, and there's some other opportunities that I might be able to feed people into around kind of doing some formal evaluation. But to think about that evaluation, so you have a sense of why it might be important to you or how you might do it, that you can think in relation to your own private practice, the strengths and limitations of using perhaps qualitative and quantitative tools, and how that can enhance not only your work and the efficacy of your practice, but also how it can be immensely helpful for your clients in the things that they are wanting to focus on. And finally, and I'll speed up, session 6, networking and communities. Why is creating a community of practice so important, and why is it worth the effort, and what is it anyway? How can we do that, and how can we support each other, and what are our next steps of a group? And that's where the kind of ongoing networking groups for us are really critical to the success of this program, that it's not just a training that we deliver and then go away. We deliver the training and we create further opportunities for you to reflect and ask questions and revisit and evaluate what's worked, what's not worked, and the things you need to do. So by the end of this, think about your own particular needs, about what you need from others and how might that work, and to develop your own individual plan about connections and opportunities to speak with others. So why on earth would you do all of that? What is to be gained? By the end of all 6 sessions taken together, you will be able to describe the real key principles of setting up a private practice. You will know what is meant by that, and how a discrete private practice sits alongside other existing services, and also sits alongside some of those key services we sometimes need, like GPs, like mental health services, like schools, like education, like voluntary sector, like the police, like ambulance services. You'll be really clear and grounded in what policies and good practice statements are in place for you and what you need, and hopefully you'll have that real confidence to make clear, coherent and articulated ethical decisions, not just directly with your clients, but about the things that you do. You'll have a much clearer, or you will have revisited your kind of marketing and communication strategy with clients, current clients, potential clients. Hopefully you may also have thought about other things that you might do. And hopefully this might be the one that pushes people a little bit. Hopefully you'll be enthusiastic about evaluating your work, about using perhaps process and outcome measures, or if not that, at least have some mechanism of evaluating what you do. Because if you don't do that, frankly, how on earth do you know that you're effective? How on earth do you know that you're good? And if people aren't coming back, or you're not getting people through, you will only be able to speculate if you've not asked those questions. So I'm going to spend literally 5 minutes rewinding back to session 2, and one of the things we'll talk about in session 2 is thinking about risk. I'm just going to showcase this is not all that we're going to do, it's just a little dip into it. Risk is a big issue. It's an area that I have done a lot of reading, research and writing about. It's an area that touches me in every part of my work all of the time, and it's the area that many people are quite anxious about. So what we will do in the session is not just talk about risk in a generic sense, but map it onto the independent practitioner. Working with risk in organizations can feel quite different to working with risk in private practice. If we have a client who we are concerned about, what happens if we have a client that we're concerned about where suddenly the online connection disappears, or somebody walks away from our practice room? How the ethics work for this. We contract for ethics, but we don't have the same policies and procedures that we might have in an organizational setting. So how can we recreate for themselves? What we don't do as therapists is simply refer on everybody who might self-injure, or who might sometimes have thoughts of suicide. We work proactively with people. That's what therapists do. That's what we're good at. So how in a private practice setting can we manage face-to-face and online risk? And what proactive steps can we take to continue to explore risk in a therapeutic rather than kind of a back covering defensive way, because I think that we can do some amazing things in private practice around risk, and probably most of the people who I see for therapy in private practice do or have presented with risk at some stage. So it's something that's very much present in my own work. We're going to unpack a little bit around what we mean by risk. We're going to help us in a private practice setting move away from risk being binary, that risk is present or it's not present, because of course we all know that's nonsense. That risk is a multifaceted, multi-layered aspect, and we're going to unpack that a little bit in relation to private practice. And think about risk in a broader sense, rather than just about safeguarding suicide, self-injury, child protection, and so forth, but the different types of risks, and again how they present in kind of our practice settings. So I will briefly talk about situational, relational, contextual, professional, and personal risks, all of how they relate to the independent practitioner, not just in generic terms, but how they may present in independent practice, because we focus on the situational risks, which I would class as the kind of safeguarding, child protection, those sorts of things, but the relational, contextual, professional, personal are profound and are very, very present in our work. Because what we're going to do as independent practitioners is take positive risks. We're bound to do that. If we're not going to take positive risks, we might as well simply put on our website, please see your local GP or your local mental health service, rather than coming to see me. And that sounds a bit flippant, but what I mean by that is that we will work in private practice with the same sorts of clients that we might work with in organizational settings. And often people will choose to see an independent practitioner because they want to explore issues of risk for them out of their working environment or out of their family environment. They want a choice about who they speak to. So we will think about, what does positive risk taking in independent practice, private practice, look like? And just some tips for good practice around risk in independent practice. We need to be having our conversations with supervisors now about mutual expectations of risk in an independent practice setting. What do you expect of me, and what do I expect of you? We need to be clear about, when we're working with a client in an independent practice setting, what other parameters might be there. It might be due to the age of the client or the client's capacity at that particular point, or it might be that we've had a referral through from an employee assistance program, an EAP, where there are particular policies and processes that we need to follow. We're not working in an organization, so we don't have those policies and procedures of an organization, which are, as we have said, both wonderful and irritating, often in equal measure. So what do we do instead? Rather than just leaving a blank slate, my suggestion will be that we start to develop our own practice statements, where we begin to benchmark good practice for ourselves. They don't have to be lengthy, they don't have to be long-winded, but they can be shared with clients. So when we're contracting, we're talking with clients about risk, we have a kind of a benchmarking statement that's written in accessible language that we work to, and the client knows where they stand. Of course, we need to be familiar with good practice guidance and ethical expectations, and I will point you in the direction of some really good resources. And also think about how in an independent practice, and how online particularly, we can draw on some key therapeutic tools like keep safe plans to help the client keep themselves safe. And how are we going to support ourselves? We know from research that working with risk in an organization or in private practice can be linked with vicarious trauma, that it can be hugely challenging for all practitioners, and particularly for those in independent practice, about how do we look after ourselves. And this is where the communities of practice comes in. That's a very quick whistle-stop tour of some of the considerations of private practice for working with risk, and that's the kind of content that we will delve into in much more detail, and that will be supported by discussion, by sharing your own experiences, by me sharing my experiences, so that we can kind of really build something that's three-dimensional. So we have just less than 10 minutes left, and I suppose it's an opportunity for kind of two areas, really. What do you need as a private practitioner? What would you want to be included in this course? Because I'm still writing the content within those parameters. So if there's stuff that you want in there, then let's talk about it, and I can make sure that we address those things. And of course, we have Julia and Paul here. So, you know, if there's specific questions about the course for SDS, it's a great opportunity to ask them. I haven't seen any of the chat, so I don't know what's been going on there, but I'm going to stop sharing now. That was a reduced Shakespeare Company version of 12 hours of CPD and what it's going to look like. Over to you. I hope that people are going to put their hands up and unmute and tell us what they think, or if you've got any questions, or is there stuff as an independent practitioner that you would really want to be included?
Andrew, thank you. And I love your timekeeping. You've left some time for question, which is wonderful. We have some really nice positive comments in the chat box, like thanks for lovely insight into private practice, for example. But Indy asks a question which I think lots of people probably thinking. If people already have a website, would you look into how to maximize this, such as search engine optimization or paid ads and so on? So how are you going to work on that aspect with people who already have their own website and their own private practice?
Yeah, we can certainly do that. We can certainly look at kind of things like Google optimization and the kind of steps we can do around our metadata and keywords in our metadata to ensure that what we're communicating is picked up by Google. If we are building a site, there are some excellent tools, some of which are free and some of which often have a little bit of an additional pay for, which will do things like web optimization. So Google is picking up on those things a bit more. If you have a site already, then it will be hosted somewhere and will be constructed in some mechanism. And so we can look as to how you can go to your site host to see what tools they have. So there's things that we can do, and there's also things that we can get others to do, some of which are free and some of which are paid for. And also hints and tips like it's often really useful to have a contact form on the site rather than your phone number, because unless your phone number is presented as an image, because if you have your phone number, a business number, say, typed out onto a website, then Google does an extremely good job of picking that that number, and you will be very likely over a short period of time start to get all sorts of spam calls and email address as well. So you'll start to get nuisance calls on your business phone and spam calls on your kind of business email address. So to either present that information as a image, which can't as easily be picked up, or I use a contact form. And touch wood, and I know I'm going to really regret saying this, but I don't get any spam emails to my business account, and I don't get any unwanted calls to my business phone either, and that's the reason I'll do it. So yes, we will definitely look at that and ways in which you can maximize the impact in your search.
Thank you. I also wanted to emphasize that Andrew is preparing a checklist at the end of each module. So you will go through the module, and then you'll have that checklist which you can check and feel yourself, and actually can do it periodically, sort of to check that your practice is still meeting those standards. That's one side of things. And the other side of things, when you mentioned Google and how they pick up words and things like that, for example, and they change all the time, don't they? So keywords was a flavor of the month a few years ago, now it's something else. And that's why we want to do those follow-up sessions, so we could discuss how this technological world is changing and how we can still meet its standards to make sure that what we do in terms of advertising our practice still is the most effective way of doing it. There's
Could I
some
pick up
more...
a couple of questions? So there was one question sent directly to me about legislation in different kind of regions and things. What I can't profess to be is a legal expert. Well, I'm not a solicitor for a start, and I can't profess to be a legal expert for the range of regions that people might be working in. So what I can do, however, is highlight good practice indicators for those key parameters for how you ensure your work is safe. Because obviously working online, we can work in the UK with people abroad and vice versa. And I know there are some large organizations at the moment who have a high profile on social media who promise to pass clients through, and there can be advantages and disadvantages in that. So we can talk about how we keep ourselves savvy and keep ourselves safe in that. Two other very quick things, Julia. I want it to be really collaborative in response to Alice's question. If in the actual course people don't unmute and talk to me, it'll be less collaborative. I can read some stuff in the chat, but it's while I'm reading in the chat, I'm not paying attention to the group. So my style is, if you haven't picked it up already, is that I like to talk with people. So I really want the group to be as interactive as people feel comfortable. So as collaborative as I can possibly make it. And the risk factor, Fiona, working with risk is often the big tripping hazard for people, and it's the thing that makes people most anxious. I want to try and address that a little bit and think about ways in which we can work privately as safely as we can do in an organization.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. And Dawn is asking, I quite like that question, so maybe it's something for you, Andrew, to consider, how you can still participate in research if you're in private practice. So to participate, conduct, or maybe collaborate with somebody else in terms of research and private practice. Well, thank you so much, guys, for your questions. And please continue sending them to us. If you have questions which you wanted to ask and haven't had a chance, because we obviously will be finishing at 8, you have our company email address. It's info@sds-seminars.com. Please send us your questions. We will always pass them to Andrew, and because he's still preparing the course, he still has the chance to incorporate your questions in the course outline. Okay, thank you very much for coming. Andrew, thank you very much for your time, and Paul as well. And I hope you will join us for this very first certificate in private practice, and I'm sure it will be incredibly useful for all the participants. Thank you, have a good evening, and bye for now. Bye. You can unmute and say bye-bye. I forget to say that.
Take care, folks.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Take care. Look after yourselves.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.